The first thing people usually noticed about me was my face. The second was that I didn't seem to notice them noticing. I had heard every version of it. You're ridiculously handsome. Do you have a girlfriend? Why are you single? Are you seriously not interested in anyone? I always laughed it off. Sometimes I smiled politely. Sometimes I changed the subject. And sometimes, when someone was being especially persistent, I simply told them the truth. I'm not looking for anything. It wasn't that I hated relationships. I didn't. I just had never met anyone who made me want to stop and think, maybe this person is different. People seemed to think being wanted was the same thing as wanting someone. It wasn't. At least it wasn't for me. I was 24, young enough to still feel like my life was only beginning, but old enough to know that I didn't want to waste my time pretending to feel something I didn't. So I stayed single. And honestly, I was perfectly happy that way. I had my own apartment, a quiet routine, a job I didn't hate, and one person I could always count on. My best friend, John. If someone had asked me who knew me better than anyone else in the world, I wouldn't have needed to think. John. We had been friends for years. He had seen me at my best and at my absolute worst. He was there when I got my first job. He was there when I had a terrible week and wanted to disappear from everyone. He was the person who could make me laugh when I was so frustrated that I wanted to throw my phone across the room. And somehow, despite how different we could be, we had never grown apart. John was loud where I was quiet. Spontaneous where I was careful. He loved parties. I preferred staying home. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave 20 minutes later knowing everyone's name. I could spend an entire evening avoiding eye contact with people I already knew. But somehow we worked. Maybe that was why I trusted him so much. I never had to pretend around John. I could sit beside him in complete silence and feel completely understood. That morning I was asleep when my phone started vibrating on the nightstand. I ignored it. The screen lit up. Then went dark. A few seconds later it lit up again. I groaned and buried my face deeper into my pillow. Whoever it was clearly had no respect for sleeping people. The phone vibrated a third time. Finally, I reached out blindly and grabbed it. Hello. There was a pause. Then John's voice exploded through the speaker. Max. Finally. I pulled the phone away from my ear. John, do you know what time it is? Almost noon. Exactly. So you're awake. I am now. He laughed. You sound angry. I am angry. You'll survive. I sighed and sat up. My hair was probably a disaster, and sunlight was already slipping through the curtains, filling my bedroom with that bright summer glow I usually appreciated much more when I wasn't being forced to wake up because of it. What do you want? I need you here today. I frowned. For what? Pool party. No. He laughed immediately. I haven't even explained it. You don't have to. Max. No. Max. John. Come on. Absolutely not. He groaned dramatically. It isn't going to be one of those huge parties. Just some friends. Music, food, swimming, and you. Especially not the last part. What does that mean? It means you know I hate these things. You don't hate them. I hate people. You don't hate people. I hate crowds. You hate being dragged into things. That too. There was silence for a moment. Then his voice softened. Please. I knew that tone. John rarely begged. And when he did, he knew exactly what he was doing. I really want you here. I closed my eyes. You could have just asked normally. I did. You called me 3 times. Because you're impossible. I laughed despite myself. That was John. He could somehow make annoying me feel like affection. Fine, I said. There was a victorious shout on the other end. Yes. But I'm not staying all night. Deal. And if it gets too crowded, I'm leaving. Deal. And I'm not swimming. Max. What? You're coming to a pool party? I can sit beside the pool. John groaned. Fine. Just come. I agreed mostly because it was John. Not because I wanted to go. And definitely not because I was curious about the people who would be there. At least that's what I told myself. An hour later, I was standing in front of my closet trying to decide what to wear. Nothing fancy. I grabbed a simple shirt, shorts, and sunglasses. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I had never been the kind of person who dressed differently just because certain people might be watching. Or so I thought. By the time I arrived at John's house, the front gate was already open. His family home was huge. Beautiful. Expensive in a way that didn't feel flashy. A long driveway led toward the house, surrounded by perfectly trimmed trees and flowers. Music floated through the open windows, and I could already hear people laughing near the backyard. I stepped through the entrance. John spotted me almost immediately. "Max." He came running toward me and pulled me into a hug. "You actually came." I said I would. "I didn't believe you." "That says a lot about our friendship." He laughed and grabbed my shoulder. "Come on. Everyone's outside." As I followed him through the house, I could hear the pool party getting louder. People were talking. Someone was playing music. There were drinks and food spread across long tables. The sunlight reflected off the water in the backyard, and for a moment I had to admit it was beautiful. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. John introduced me to a few people, though most of them immediately seemed more interested in talking to me than necessary. One guy smiled at me and said, "You're John's best friend?" "Yeah." "Okay." I raised an eyebrow. "Okay." He laughed awkwardly. "Nothing." "I get it now." I had no idea what that meant. John rolled his eyes. "Don't encourage him." I laughed. Then I felt it. Someone looking at me. Not casually. Not the way people normally glanced at someone attractive. It was different. I turned. And that's when I saw him. Edward. John's older brother. Standing near the far side of the pool. He wasn't doing anything. He didn't have to. He simply stood there with one hand resting against the edge of the table, sunlight falling across his face, looking completely calm while the entire party seemed to move around him. I had seen Edward before. Many times. But somehow that afternoon he looked different. Or maybe I was the one seeing him differently. Our eyes met. For a second neither of us looked away. And I had the strangest feeling that something had just changed. I didn't know what it was. I didn't understand it. I only knew that when Edward finally looked away, I couldn't stop looking at him. I told myself I was imagining it. That was the easiest explanation. Edward was John's older brother. He had probably looked at me because I was standing there staring at him like an idiot. That was all. Nothing more. So I forced myself to turn away. John was still talking to me, completely unaware of the war happening inside my head. "You haven't eaten anything," he said, pointing toward the table. "Go get something." "I'm not hungry." "You're always hungry." "Not always. You are when I'm paying." I laughed. "That's because your family has better food than I do." "Exactly. So eat." He pushed a plate into my hands and disappeared into the crowd before I could argue. I looked down at it. Then, against my better judgment, I looked back toward where Edward had been standing. He was gone. I felt strangely disappointed. I immediately hated myself for noticing. Why did I care where he was? I didn't. At least I shouldn't. I walked toward the pool and sat on one of the empty chairs. The music was louder now. A few people were swimming. Others were sitting around talking. I tried to relax. For the next several minutes, I managed to forget about Edward. I talked to John. I laughed at a stupid story one of his friends was telling. I even got dragged into a game near the pool. Everything felt normal. Until Edward appeared again. This time he was walking directly toward us. I noticed him before anyone else did. He stopped beside John. "Everything okay?" he asked. John smiled. "Yeah." Max finally decided to leave his apartment. Edward laughed softly. His eyes moved toward me. "I'm glad you came." Those 4 words shouldn't have affected me. But they did. "Thanks," I said. It was the most ordinary answer possible. Still, Edward kept looking at me for another second before turning back to John. John didn't notice anything strange. I did. There was something in Edward's expression. Something I couldn't explain. I spent the next hour trying to avoid him. It was ridiculous. I had no reason to be nervous around him. He hadn't done anything. But every time I saw him across the yard, my heart seemed to beat a little faster. I tried talking to other people. I joined John near the pool. I even agreed to play a ridiculous water game I had originally promised I wouldn't participate in. Nothing worked. My attention kept drifting back to Edward. At one point, John disappeared inside to get more drinks. I was standing near the pool alone when Edward approached. "Having fun?" I smiled awkwardly. "Actually, yeah." "Surprised?" "A little." He laughed. "You always hated parties." "I still do." "So why are you here?" "John." Edward nodded. "Of course." There was a silence. Not uncomfortable exactly. Just intense. I looked away. "So, you're enjoying yourself?" I asked. "More now." I looked back at him. "What does that mean?" He smiled but didn't answer. Before I could ask again, someone called Edward from across the yard. He looked toward the voice. Then back at me. "I'll see you later." He walked away. I watched him go. And for the first time in my life I found myself wondering whether someone had been flirting with me. Edward. The thought was absurd. Impossible. I shook my head. No. I whispered it to myself. No way. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The party continued into the afternoon. The sun was lower now and the heat had softened. John came back and dropped into the chair beside me. What's wrong with you? Nothing. You've been quiet. I'm always quiet. Not like this. I looked at him. What do you mean? You keep staring at nothing. I was thinking. About? Nothing. John narrowed his eyes. You're lying. I'm not. He grinned. You're terrible at lying. I pushed his shoulder. Shut up. He laughed. Then he stood. Come on. Where? Inside. Why? I need help with something. I followed him into the house. We walked through the hallway toward the kitchen. John opened a cabinet and started searching. What are you looking for? Nothing important. Then why am I here? Because you're tall. I stared at him. You brought me inside because I'm tall? Exactly. I laughed. You're an idiot. He smiled. That's why you love me. We were both laughing when I suddenly heard footsteps behind us. I turned. Edward. He stopped when he saw us. John looked between us. Edward, do you know where Mom keeps the extra glasses? Edward pointed toward another cabinet. Top shelf. Thanks. John walked away. I was left standing there with Edward. Alone. Again. I suddenly felt nervous, which annoyed me, because I wasn't usually nervous around anyone. Edward moved closer. You seem distracted today. I shrugged. Maybe. By what? Nothing. He smiled. You're not very convincing. I looked at him. Neither are you. His expression changed slightly. What do you mean? I didn't know. I hadn't even meant to say it, but the words had slipped out. You've been looking at me. Silence. Edward didn't deny it. Instead he took a slow breath. Yes. My heart skipped. Why? He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, because I've been trying very hard not to. I didn't understand. What does that mean? Edward looked like he was about to say something. But John came back. Got them? Edward immediately stepped away. I looked at him. He looked at me. Then the moment was gone. As evening approached, people began leaving. The party was slowly becoming quieter. I knew I should leave too. John walked me toward the front door. Thanks for coming. I almost didn't. I know. He smiled. You're coming next time too. Don't push your luck. He laughed. I stepped outside. Then I heard my name. Max. I turned. Edward was standing a few feet away. John was already walking back toward the backyard, completely unaware. Edward approached me. Can we talk? Something in his voice made me stop. About what? Please. I hesitated. Then I nodded. He led me toward the side of the house. Away from the noise. Away from everyone. The music became distant. The sound of the pool disappeared behind the walls. We stopped beneath a quiet terrace where the evening air had become cool. Edward turned toward me. For a moment he said nothing. I waited. Then he took a breath. There's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. My stomach tightened. Edward. I know. He looked nervous. Actually nervous. I had never seen him like that. He stepped closer. I've tried to ignore it. I couldn't move. I've told myself it was wrong. His eyes stayed on mine. I told myself you were my brother's best friend. He took another breath. And I told myself I should stay away from you. My heart was pounding now. Then why didn't you? His eyes softened. Because every time I saw you I failed. I stared at him. What are you saying? Edward stepped closer. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. I'm saying. He swallowed. I can't pretend anymore. And then he looked at me in a way that made every thought in my mind disappear. I've fallen in love with you, Max. The world seemed to go completely silent. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to feel. All I could do was stare at the man standing in front of me. Edward looked terrified. And before I could understand what was happening, he leaned toward me and kissed me. For a few seconds I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I couldn't even breathe properly. Edward's lips had barely touched mine, but it felt as though someone had reached into my chest and rearranged everything inside me. My eyes were still open when he pulled away. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than the music coming from the backyard. Then Edward whispered my name. Max. I finally stepped backward. One step. Then another. What did you just do? His expression immediately changed. I'm sorry. You kissed me. I know. You just... I couldn't even finish the sentence. My hand went instinctively to my lips. I could still feel it. That was what scared me the most. I could still feel his kiss. And somewhere beneath all the shock and confusion was another emotion I didn't want to admit existed. I had felt something. For a second, when Edward kissed me, I hadn't wanted it to end. That thought terrified me. Why would you do that? I asked. Edward looked at the ground. Because I couldn't keep pretending. You knew you shouldn't. I know. You're John's brother. I know. And I'm his best friend. I know, Max. His voice broke slightly. I know all of it. I stared at him. Then why? He looked back at me. Because I'm in love with you. I felt my chest tighten. He said it again. Not like a joke. Not like a temporary feeling. Not like something he could take back. I've been trying to stop, he continued. For longer than you realize. I shook my head. I don't understand. You don't have to. Then why tell me? Because I couldn't carry it anymore. He took a slow breath. I see you with John. I see how much you care about him. I know what you mean to my family. He looked directly into my eyes. And every time you're here, I tell myself that I should leave you alone. His voice became quieter. But I can't. I didn't know how to respond. Every part of my mind was telling me to walk away. To tell him this was a mistake. To remind him that nothing could happen between us. That would have been the sensible thing. The safe thing. Instead, I just stood there. Frozen. Edward took one small step toward me. I never wanted to make you uncomfortable. His eyes were filled with something I had never seen in them before. Fear. I swear I didn't. I swallowed. You should have told me before you kissed me. I know. I could be angry with you. You should be. I looked away. I am. It was easier to say that than to admit anything else. Edward nodded. I understand. He stepped back. I won't bother you again. Something about those words made my stomach twist. But I didn't understand why. I crossed my arms. This can't happen. I know. John can never know. I know. And we can't. I stopped. Edward waited. We can't do this. He nodded slowly. Okay. His voice sounded defeated. That hurt more than I expected. I immediately hated myself for caring. I turned toward the house. I'm going home. Max. I stopped. I didn't look back. Edward spoke quietly. I really am sorry. I closed my eyes. Then I walked away. The drive home felt longer than usual. The roads were familiar. The streetlights passed one after another. My hands were tight around the steering wheel. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the same moment. Edward leaning toward me. His lips touching mine. His voice saying, I'm in love with you. I turned the music up. It didn't help. I turned it off again. That didn't help either. I tried telling myself I was angry. That made sense. He had crossed a line. He had taken something I wasn't prepared for and dropped it directly into my life. But if I was so angry, why did I keep touching my lips? I noticed myself doing it and immediately pulled my hand away. Stop. I said it out loud. Just stop. I drove the rest of the way in silence. When I reached my apartment, I threw my keys onto the counter and went straight to my bedroom. I changed, washed my face, drank a glass of water, then sat on the edge of my bed. For the next 10 minutes, I stared at the floor. I tried to think about something else. Or John. The party. Anything. But every thought eventually returned to Edward. I wondered how long he'd felt this way. Days. Months. Years. Had I really been completely unaware? Then another question came. Did I feel something too? I immediately rejected it. No. The word came out almost automatically. I stood up. No. I don't. But my voice sounded uncertain. The next morning, John called. I watched his name appear on my screen. I almost didn't answer. Eventually, I did. Hey. Morning. I could hear him smiling. You disappeared last night. I went home. I know. There was a pause. Everything okay? My heart started pounding. Yeah. You sure? Of course. John laughed. You're weird. I've always been weird. Not like this. I sat on my bed. What do you mean? You're quiet. I'm tired. From what? Sitting by the pool? I smiled weakly. Maybe. He laughed. Then his voice became quieter. I wanted to ask you something. What? Did Edward say anything to you yesterday? My entire body went still. I stared at the wall. Why? Because he was acting strange after you left. My throat tightened. What do you mean? I don't know. He was just quiet. I forced myself to sound normal. Maybe he's tired too. Maybe. John didn't seem convinced. Anyway, I wanted to ask if you want to come over tonight. I looked down. Tonight? Yeah. I don't know. Come on. Just hang out. The thought of going back to that house made my chest tighten. Seeing Edward again was the last thing I wanted. Or maybe the thing I wanted most. That was the problem. I'll think about it. John groaned. That means no. I didn't say no. You always say that when you mean no. I laughed quietly. Fine. I'll come. Good. He sounded relieved. See you tonight. When the call ended, I placed my phone beside me. Then I stared at it. Why had I agreed? I knew exactly why. I wanted to see Edward. The realization hit me so hard that I immediately stood up. No. I paced across the room. This is stupid. I had known him for years. He was my best friend's older brother. Nothing could happen. Nothing should happen. But the fact remained. I wanted to see him. That evening, I went to John's house. The front door opened before I even knocked. John grinned. You actually came. You're going to stop being surprised eventually. No chance. I stepped inside. The house was quieter than yesterday. No music. No crowd. Just the familiar quiet of the large home. I looked around. Where is everyone? My parents went out. And Edward? I asked before I could stop myself. John raised an eyebrow. You asking about my brother? I quickly looked away. No. I was just wondering. John smiled. Okay. He obviously didn't believe me. He's upstairs, I think. My stomach tightened. I nodded. Cool. We went into the living room. For the next hour, John and I talked about everything except what had happened. I laughed. I relaxed. For a few minutes, I almost forgot. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. I looked up. Edward. Our eyes met. Everything inside me went still. He stopped halfway down the stairs. I couldn't read his expression. He looked surprised to see me. Then his eyes moved toward John. John was completely unaware of the tension between us. Edward, he said casually, come sit with us. Edward hesitated. Then he nodded. He came downstairs. He sat across from me. Not beside me. Not too close. Just far enough away to make it obvious that he was keeping his promise. He wasn't bothering me. He barely looked at me. And somehow, that hurt. I had expected awkwardness. I had expected him to say something. Instead, he treated me like a stranger. I hated how much I noticed. John eventually got up to grab something from the kitchen. The second he left, silence filled the room. Edward finally looked at me. Hi. One word. Nothing more. Hi. He looked away. I meant what I said yesterday. My heart beat faster. I won't bring it up again. I didn't answer. He continued. I don't want things to be uncomfortable for you. I swallowed. Okay. I'll give you space. Okay. He nodded. Then he stood. I'm going upstairs. Something in me wanted to stop him. I didn't. He walked away. I watched until he disappeared. And then I realized something I wasn't prepared to accept. I didn't want space. I wanted him to stay. That was the moment I became afraid of my own heart. Because maybe Edward hadn't created these feelings in me. Maybe he had only given them a name. And maybe I had been falling for him long before that kiss. I just hadn't been brave enough to notice. The next few days were the strangest days of my life. Nothing had technically changed. The sun still rose every morning. My phone still buzzed with messages. Work still demanded my attention. John still called me almost every day. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. But inside me, everything was different. I couldn't stop thinking about Edward. And I hated that. I tried to distract myself. I worked longer hours. I went to the gym. I watched movies I didn't even care about. I cleaned my apartment twice in one day because I had nothing else to do. Nothing worked. Every quiet moment brought him back. His face. His voice. The nervous look in his eyes when he'd confessed. And that kiss. Especially that kiss. I kept telling myself it had been a mistake. That Edward had been emotional. That I had been caught off guard. That I was simply confused. But none of those explanations answered the question I kept trying to avoid. Why had I kissed him back? I didn't remember deciding to do it. I didn't remember thinking about it. For one brief moment, I had simply stopped fighting. And that scared me more than anything. John noticed I was distant. Of course he did. He knew me too well. One evening he called while I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment. "You've been avoiding me." I looked at the city lights. "I haven't." "You have." "I've just been busy." "With what?" "Life." He laughed. "That sounds like something an 80-year-old man would say." I smiled. "Maybe I'm 80. You're terrible at pretending." I sighed. "What do you want?" "I want my best friend back." His voice was softer this time. That made me feel guilty. "I'm still here." "Then act like it." I looked down at my hands. "I'm sorry." There was silence. Then John asked, "Did I do something?" The question hit me harder than it should have. "No." "Did someone else?" My heart skipped. I didn't answer quickly enough. John noticed. "Max." "I'm fine." "That's not an answer." I took a breath. "It's nothing." He sighed. "Okay." I could tell he didn't believe me. "But if something is wrong." He paused. "You can tell me." "I know. You're my brother, man." That sentence nearly broke me. Not because I was angry. Because John had no idea how much I was hiding from him. "Thanks," I whispered. "Anytime." We ended the call a few minutes later. I stayed on the balcony long after the screen went dark. I loved John. He was my best friend. My family and everything but blood. And that was exactly why I was so terrified. Because if I admitted what I felt for Edward, I didn't know what it would do to the person who meant the most to me. 2 days later, John invited me over for dinner. I almost said no. Then I realized avoiding his house wouldn't make Edward disappear from my mind. So I went. When I arrived, John opened the door with his usual smile. "There you are." "Here I am." He pulled me inside. "Come on. Dinner's almost ready." The house felt strangely familiar. I had been here countless times. But now every hallway seemed connected to a memory. The terrace. The kitchen. The stairs. The place where Edward had stood. The place where he'd kissed me. I tried not to look toward the side of the house. I failed. John noticed. "You okay?" "Yeah." He studied me for a second. Then shook his head. "Come on." We went into the dining room. For the first few minutes, everything was normal. We talked. We joked. John told me a ridiculous story about someone he knew. I laughed. Then Edward walked in. I nearly stopped breathing. He had changed since I last saw him. Or maybe I was simply noticing him more now. He was wearing a simple dark shirt and jeans. Nothing special. Yet somehow he looked impossible to ignore. He stopped when he saw me. Our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. John looked between us. "Why are you two acting like you barely know each other?" My heart jumped. Edward answered calmly. "We're not." I looked down. John shrugged. "Okay." He went back to his food. Edward sat across from me. I tried not to stare. I failed again. His eyes found mine several times during dinner. Each time I looked away. The tension became unbearable. When dinner ended, John grabbed his phone. "I need to take this." He stepped out of the room. And suddenly I was alone with Edward. Again. Neither of us spoke. Finally, Edward said, "You look tired." I forced a smile. "I'm fine." "You don't have to say that around me." I looked at him. "Why?" "Because I know you." That sentence stayed with me. I lowered my voice. "You don't know me that well." Edward gave a sad smile. "I know more than you think." I looked down. "Edward, I won't ask you for anything." I looked back at him. "Then why are you talking to me?" "Because pretending I don't care about you is harder than I expected." My chest tightened. He continued. "I don't want to pressure you." "You're not." "You seemed angry." "I was." "I know." He paused. "I deserved that." I didn't say anything. Edward looked away. "I've replayed that night 100 times." "So have I." The words escaped before I could stop them. Edward looked at me immediately. "You have." I froze. I could have taken it back. I didn't. "Yes." Something changed in his expression. "Oh." And that frightened me. "I shouldn't have said that." "But you did." I swallowed. "I don't know what I'm doing." "You don't have to know yet. That's the problem." I stood. "I've never felt like this." Edward stood too. "Neither have I." We were only a few feet apart. I could feel my heartbeat. Edward didn't move closer. He respected the distance between us. And somehow that made it harder. "I need time," I said. He nodded. "Take all the time you need." I turned away. Then he said my name. "Max." I stopped. "I meant what I told you." I closed my eyes. I know. I walked away before I could say anything else. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about Edward's face. His restraint. His patience. The fact that he hadn't tried to convince me. He had simply waited. And suddenly I realized something. Maybe I hadn't been avoiding Edward because I was afraid of him. Maybe I had been avoiding him because I was afraid of myself. I sat up. The room was silent. I whispered the truth that I had been fighting for days. I miss him. My throat tightened. I covered my face with both hands. I miss Edward. Once I admitted it aloud, everything became clearer. I remembered every little moment. The first time I had really noticed him. The way he looked at me at the pool. The way his voice changed when he said my name. The way he looked terrified after kissing me. He hadn't looked proud. He hadn't looked confident. He had looked like someone who had risked everything just to tell the truth. And maybe that was why I couldn't forget him. Because I believed him. I believed that he loved me. The next morning, I woke up with a decision. I was going to see him. Not because John had invited me. Not because I had an excuse. Because I needed to talk to Edward. Because I needed to know what was happening inside my own heart. That afternoon, I drove to John's house. The entire journey felt unreal. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my heart wasn't. I parked outside and sat there for almost a minute. Then I finally stepped out. The front door was unlocked. I knocked anyway. No answer. John? Silence. I stepped inside. The house was quiet. I called his name again. Nothing. I was about to leave when I heard movement upstairs. My heart immediately started pounding. Edward. A few seconds later, Edward appeared at the top of the stairs. He stopped when he saw me. Neither of us spoke. Then he came downstairs. You're here. I know. A tiny smile appeared on his face. What happened? John isn't home. I know. I came to talk. His expression became serious. About what? I looked at him. For the first time I didn't look away. About us. Edward went completely still. Max. I know what I said before. I remember. I know this is complicated. It is. I know John is your brother. Yes. And I know this could change everything. Edward nodded. I took a slow breath. But I also know something else. He waited. I stepped closer. I can't stop thinking about you. His expression softened. Neither can I. And I tried. I know. I really tried. I know. I looked into his eyes. My heart was pounding so hard that I was sure he could hear it. Then I whispered. But it didn't work. Edward didn't move. Neither did I. For the first time I stopped running from what I felt. And I realized that maybe going to his house that afternoon wasn't the beginning of a mistake. Maybe it was the beginning of finally telling the truth. For a few seconds, Edward simply stared at me. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. I had imagined this moment so many times during the past few days, but none of those imaginary versions had prepared me for standing in front of him with my heart completely exposed. Edward was the first to break the silence. Max. There was something almost fragile in the way he said my name. I swallowed. I need to tell you something. You don't have to. Yes, I do. He looked at me carefully. Are you sure? I nodded. For the first time since all of this had started, I was sure about something. I came here because I couldn't keep pretending. Edward took a slow breath. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. I don't. I mean it. I know. I don't want you to say something because you're afraid of hurting me. I'm not. He looked into my eyes. Then why are you here? I opened my mouth. The words were there. I had carried them with me all the way from my apartment. But saying them suddenly felt terrifying. Because once I said them, there was no going back. I'm here because... My voice caught. Edward waited patiently. I'm here because I miss you. His eyes softened. I looked down. I know that sounds ridiculous. It doesn't. It does to me. Why? Because I spent days telling myself I shouldn't. I took a breath. I told myself I was angry with you. You were. I was. I smiled faintly. But that wasn't the whole truth. Edward stayed quiet. I continued. The whole truth is that I couldn't stop thinking about you. His expression changed. Hope flickered in his eyes, but he didn't allow himself to believe it yet. I thought about what you said. I paused. Over and over. Edward looked away for a moment. I was afraid you'd hate me. I don't. Are you sure? Yes. He looked back at me. I was angry. I know. I was confused. I know. And I was scared. Edward's voice became softer. Scared of me? No. I took one step closer. Scared of what I felt. His breathing changed. I could see the emotion building in his eyes. I had never seen Edward look uncertain before. But now he did. He looked like someone standing at the edge of something enormous, afraid that one wrong movement could make everything disappear. I've never felt this way before, I admitted. He whispered, neither have I. I smiled sadly. That's why I ran. Edward nodded. I understand. But I don't want to run anymore. His eyes met mine. Max. I took another step closer. I don't know when it started. He didn't move. Maybe it was that day at the pool. I shook my head. No. It probably started before that. Edward's expression softened. I think I've been noticing you for longer than I admitted to myself. He gave the smallest smile. I noticed you a long time ago. I laughed nervously. Apparently, I was the last person to figure it out. Maybe. He smiled. And somehow, that simple smile made the tension in my chest disappear. For the first time since the pool party, I felt like I could breathe. Then I said the words I had been most afraid to say. I love you too. Edward froze. His eyes widened slightly. I felt my entire body shake with nerves. But I didn't take it back. I love you too. He stared at me as though he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Say that again. I smiled through the tears threatening to form in my eyes. I love you. Edward's face changed completely. The guarded expression disappeared. The fear disappeared. For one beautiful moment he looked almost overwhelmed. Max. I stepped forward. I tried to forget you. He swallowed. I know. I tried to convince myself this was impossible. It is complicated. I know. I don't want to hurt John. Neither do I. I don't want to lose you. You won't. His voice broke slightly on those last words. I reached for him. My arms went around him. Edward went completely still. Then, slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arms around me. And the second he did, something inside me finally let go. I rested my head against his shoulder. For days I had been carrying so much uncertainty. Now I simply stood there holding the man I had been trying so hard not to love. Edward whispered near my ear. Are you really here? I smiled. I'm really here. You're not going to leave? I don't want to. He held me tighter. I've wanted to do this for so long. I closed my eyes. Then don't let go yet. I won't. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. No music. No crowd. No pressure. Just us. Two people who had spent too long being afraid of something that had already become real. Eventually I pulled back. Edward looked at me. There were tears in his eyes. I had never seen him cry. That alone nearly broke my heart. You're crying? I whispered. He laughed softly. I know. Why? Because I thought I'd lost you before I ever had you. I shook my head. You didn't lose me. He looked at me. I'm still here. Then I leaned closer. For a second we simply looked at each other. This time there was no uncertainty. No confusion. No fear. I touched his cheek. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then I kissed him. A gentle kiss. Nothing rushed. Nothing desperate. Just the quiet certainty that we were finally choosing the same thing. When we pulled apart, Edward rested his forehead against mine. I've wanted to do that again since the day I first saw you. I smiled. You should have told me. I was afraid. Of me. Of losing you. I looked into his eyes. You never had to be afraid. He smiled. I am now. I laughed. Why? Because now that I have you, I have something to lose. I shook my head. You're impossible. And you're still here. I am. We sat together in the living room afterward. Everything felt different. Not because the room had changed. Because I had. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was hiding from my own heart. Edward took my hand. There's one thing we have to talk about. John. He nodded. I sighed. I know. I don't want to keep this from him. Neither do I. But I don't know how he'll react. He loves you. He loves you too. Edward smiled. That doesn't mean he'll love this. I looked down at our hands. I don't want him to think I betrayed him. You didn't. I know that. We just have to be honest. I nodded. The thought of telling John still terrified me. But somehow it didn't feel impossible anymore. Because Edward was beside me. And I wasn't alone. The front door opened. We both looked up. John. My heart nearly stopped. Edward immediately released my hand. I almost laughed from the panic on both our faces. John walked into the room, looked at me, then at Edward. He stopped. Okay. Neither of us spoke. John raised an eyebrow. Why do you both look like you've been caught doing something? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Edward looked at me. I looked at him. John crossed his arms. Guys. I finally stood. John, there's something I need to tell you. His smile disappeared. What happened? I took a breath. Nothing bad. That doesn't sound reassuring. Edward stood too. We were both nervous now. John looked between us. What's going on? I glanced at Edward, then back at my best friend. And suddenly I realized that telling John was going to be the hardest part of all. Because I could face my feelings. I could face my fear. But I couldn't bear the thought of losing the person who had been beside me through everything. I took one final breath. John? He waited. And I finally prepared myself to tell him the truth. John? My voice sounded different even to me. Too careful. Too nervous. John stood across from us, staring between me and Edward. What happened? I looked at Edward. He gave me a small nod. He wasn't going to speak for me. He knew this was something I needed to say myself. I took a breath. There's something between me and Edward. John's expression didn't change. For a second, I wondered whether he hadn't understood. Then his eyes moved slowly toward his brother. What kind of something? My heart pounded. The kind where... I stopped. John waited. I swallowed. The kind where we fell in love. Silence. Complete silence. It felt like the entire house had stopped breathing. John stared at me. Then at Edward. Then back at me. Edward finally spoke. John, I wanted to tell you. John raised a hand. Wait. Edward stopped. John looked at me. You mean, you and my brother? I nodded. Yes. How long? I hesitated. I don't really know. Edward answered quietly. For me, it started a long time ago. John looked at his brother. And you kissed him? Edward lowered his eyes. Yes. I quickly spoke. He told me how he felt. I was shocked. I got angry. I left. John's eyes came back to me. And then? I took a breath. Then I realized I couldn't stop thinking about him. John remained silent. I tried to fight it, I continued. I really did. But eventually I had to admit that I had feelings for him too. John rubbed the back of his neck. I couldn't read his expression. That frightened me more than anger would have. Finally he asked, Are you serious about each other? I looked at Edward. He was already looking at me. Yes, I said. Edward nodded. Completely. John looked down. The silence returned. I felt my stomach twisting. John? He looked up. I don't want to lose you. That was the truth I had been most afraid to say. You're my best friend. You've been there for me through everything. I never wanted to hide this from you. John's face softened slightly. I know. I was scared. Of me. Of losing you. He stared at me for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. John laughed. Not loudly. Just a short, almost disbelieving laugh. I frowned. What? He shook his head. I'm trying to understand how I somehow didn't see this coming. My mouth fell open. You knew? No. Then what do you mean? John looked at Edward. I've seen the way he looks at you. Edward's eyes widened. John? John smiled. And I've seen the way you've looked at him for years. I stared at him. What? John shrugged. You both thought you were subtle. I couldn't help laughing. We were not. Absolutely not. Edward shook his head. You're enjoying this. A little. The tension finally broke. I felt like I could breathe again. John walked toward us. He stopped in front of me. Then he pulled me into a hug. I froze. John? He squeezed me tightly. You idiot. I laughed, my eyes suddenly burning. You scared me. I know. You made me think I'd ruined everything. He pulled away and looked at me. You didn't. I stared at him. You're not angry? I was surprised. That's it. That depends. I looked worried again. On what? John pointed at Edward. If he ever hurts you. Edward raised both hands. I won't. John narrowed his eyes. I'm serious. So am I. John looked between us. Then he smiled. Then I guess I have an annoying new couple to deal with. I laughed. You're okay with this? John shook his head. I have one condition. What? He grinned. I don't want to know anything embarrassing. Edward laughed. I think that's impossible. John pointed at him. See? Already annoying. For the first time in days, all three of us laughed together. And somehow it felt natural. Like it had always been supposed to be this way. Later that evening, John and I sat outside near the pool. The same pool where everything had started. The water reflected the fading sunlight. Edward was inside getting drinks. John leaned back in his chair. So? I looked at him. So? You're really in love with my brother? I smiled. Yeah. He shook his head. I still can't believe it. Neither can I. Does he know? I laughed. I think so. John smiled. Then he became serious. You happy? I looked toward the house. Edward appeared through the glass doors carrying 3 drinks. The moment he saw me, he smiled. Without thinking, I smiled back. Then I looked at John. Yes. John nodded. Then I'm happy. Those 3 words meant more than he probably realized. Because for days I had been terrified that choosing Edward meant losing John. Now I understood something. Love wasn't always about choosing one person and abandoning another. Sometimes if you were honest enough, it could create space for both. Edward sat beside me and handed me a drink. John looked between us. Okay, this is still weird. I laughed. You'll get used to it. Probably. Edward leaned back. So what are we doing tomorrow? John answered immediately. Nothing involving me. I laughed. Edward smiled. The evening passed peacefully. No secrets. No awkwardness. No fear. For the first time since the pool party, I felt completely free. A few days later, Edward asked me to meet him alone. We drove to a quiet cafe outside the city. It wasn't anything extravagant. Just a small place with outdoor seating and warm lights. We sat across from each other. Edward took my hand across the table. You've been quiet. I've been thinking. About? Us. His fingers tightened gently around mine. Good thoughts. I smiled. Mostly. He raised an eyebrow. Mostly? I keep thinking about how strange everything is. Strange? I went to a pool party because my best friend wouldn't stop calling me. Edward laughed. And now? Now I'm sitting here holding your hand. He smiled. I like the second part better. So do I. There was a comfortable silence. Then Edward said, I don't want this to feel like something that happened because of that one kiss. I looked at him. It doesn't. I want to know you. You already do. I want to know everything. I smiled. Then you'll have to stay. His expression softened. I'm planning to. I squeezed his hand. Good. Our relationship grew slowly, and that was what made it feel real. There was no rush, no pressure, no dramatic promises we couldn't keep. Just little moments. Edward waiting for me after work. Me showing up at his house just to see him for 20 minutes. Long conversations at night. Quiet drives. Shared meals. John constantly teasing us. The first time Edward introduced me to someone as his boyfriend, I couldn't stop smiling. The first time I woke up beside him, I stared at the ceiling for several minutes simply because I couldn't believe my life had changed so much. I had spent years thinking love would arrive loudly. Instead, it arrived quietly. It looked like Edward remembering how I liked my coffee. It sounded like his voice asking whether I had eaten. It felt like his hand finding mine whenever we were sitting together. And slowly I stopped wondering whether I was doing the right thing. I knew I was. One evening, months after the pool party, the 3 of us were outside again. John was swimming. Edward and I sat beside the pool. John suddenly splashed water toward us. I jumped away. John? He laughed. Edward shook his head. You've always been impossible. John grinned. You love me anyway. I looked at him. I do. Then I glanced at Edward. And him too. Edward smiled. John groaned dramatically. Okay, enough. We all laughed. I looked around at the house, the pool, and the people beside me. The place that had once represented confusion and fear now felt like home. And I realized something. The day I almost didn't come to John's pool party was the day I accidentally walked into the life I had always wanted. Not because everything had happened perfectly. It hadn't. There had been fear, anger, confusion, and moments when I thought I would lose everything. But somehow, honesty had brought us through. I squeezed Edward's hand. He looked at me. What? Nothing. You're staring. I know. He smiled. Why? I shook my head. I was just thinking. About what? I looked at John, then back at Edward. How lucky I am. Edward's smile became softer. I'm the lucky one. I laughed. No. I am. He leaned closer. Then we're both lucky. I smiled. And for once I didn't argue. Because maybe love wasn't supposed to be perfect. Maybe it was simply supposed to be honest. And mine finally was. The same man I once thought I could never want had become the man I couldn't imagine living without. My best friend was still beside me. My heart was finally at peace. And Edward was home. Months had passed since that afternoon. Sometimes I still thought about it. The music, the sunlight, the sound of people laughing around the pool. John insisting that I come even though I had said no a dozen times. And Edward standing there, looking at me like he had been carrying a secret for years. It was strange to think that one ordinary decision could completely change a person's life. If I had stayed in bed that morning, none of this would have happened. I wouldn't have heard Edward say my name. I wouldn't have felt that first kiss. I wouldn't have spent those sleepless nights trying to understand my own heart. And I definitely wouldn't have discovered that the man I had spent so much time avoiding was actually the man I had been waiting for. Life had a strange way of putting people exactly where they needed to be. Things between Edward and me had become easier. Not perfect, but real. We no longer had to hide how we felt. I could walk into John's house and sit beside Edward without pretending there was nothing between us. I could hold his hand. I could laugh with him. I could look at him without immediately wondering whether someone was watching. And more than anything, I could finally be honest. One Sunday afternoon, I was sitting in John's backyard with my feet in the pool. John was lying across a chair beside me, scrolling through his phone. Edward was standing nearby, preparing drinks. The scene was almost identical to the day everything had started. Except this time there was no fear. No confusion. No secrets. John suddenly looked up. You know what's funny? I turned toward him. What? This whole thing started because I forced you to come here. I laughed. You absolutely did. You were complaining the entire morning. I was sleeping. You were wasting your day. I was enjoying my day. John shook his head. Same difference. Edward laughed from across the patio. John pointed at him. And somehow my brother benefited the most. Edward smiled. I wouldn't say that. John raised an eyebrow. Really? Edward walked toward us and handed me a drink. Definitely. He sat down beside me. Our shoulders touched. I smiled. John looked at us for a few seconds. Then he shook his head. You two are still disgusting. I laughed. You're just jealous. Of what? Everything. He threw a small towel at me. I caught it. You're still annoying. You love me. John pointed at Edward. Unfortunately, he does. Edward smiled. I'm getting used to sharing him. John laughed. I was here first. I looked between them. Are you two seriously arguing over me? Yes, they answered together. I laughed so hard that I nearly dropped my drink. For a moment I simply sat there and watched them. My best friend. The man I loved. Two people I had been terrified of losing. And somehow I still had both. That was the part one would always be grateful for. Later that evening, John went inside to get food. Edward and I stayed by the pool. The sun was beginning to set. The sky had turned soft and golden, and the water reflected the changing colors. Edward was quiet. I looked at him. You're thinking. He smiled. You know me too well. About what? He glanced toward the pool. I was thinking about the first time I kissed you. I laughed softly. I was thinking about that too. I still feel guilty about it. I looked at him. You shouldn't. I scared you. You did. He gave me a serious look. I never wanted that. I know. I leaned against him. But you also gave me something. What? The courage to admit something I was too afraid to say. Edward's eyes met mine. What? That I loved you. He smiled. You didn't know. Not consciously. And now. I took his hand. Now I know. He squeezed my fingers. I still can't believe you love me. Why? Because you're. He paused. You're you. I laughed. That doesn't explain anything. He smiled. I spent so long thinking you were completely out of my reach. You were wrong. I know. He leaned slightly closer. And I'm glad I was. I looked at him. So am I. A few weeks later, Edward surprised me. He asked me to meet him in the evening. I had no idea where we were going. Where are we headed? You'll see. That sounds suspicious. He laughed. You trust me. I do. Then stop asking questions. We drove for almost an hour before reaching a quiet place overlooking the city. There were lights everywhere below us. The air was cool. Edward stepped out of the car. I followed. We stood beside the railing. "This is beautiful. I wanted to bring you somewhere quiet." "Why?" He looked at me. "Because I wanted to tell you something without anyone interrupting." My heart skipped. "What?" Edward took my hands. "I've thought a lot about the future." I smiled. "That sounds serious." "It is." He took a breath. "I spent so many years believing that love would make my life complicated." I listened. "But when I met you, I realized the opposite was true." His voice softened. "You made everything make sense." I squeezed his hands. "I don't know where life is going to take us." He looked into my eyes. "But I know I want you there." I couldn't help smiling. "You have no idea how much I wanted to hear that." "I think I do." He leaned closer. I rested my forehead against his. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you too." There was no dramatic moment. No crowd. No music. No perfect speech. Just us. And somehow that made it perfect. When I look back now, I realize I spent so much of my life thinking that being wanted was enough. It wasn't. There were plenty of people who found me attractive. Plenty of people who wanted my attention. Plenty of people who thought I was someone they could fall for. But none of that had ever touched the deepest part of me. Edward did. Not because he was handsome. Not because he was charming. Not because everyone noticed him when he walked into a room. I loved him because he saw me. The real me. The quiet parts. The uncertain parts. The parts one kept hidden from everyone else. And he loved those too. He never asked me to become someone different. He simply waited for me to become brave enough to be honest. 1 year after the pool party, John decided to throw another one. When he told me, I laughed. "Seriously?" "Yes." "You're doing this again?" "Of course." Edward looked at me. "You're coming?" I smiled. "Absolutely." This time I didn't need to be convinced. I arrived early. The pool looked exactly the same. The house looked the same. The sunlight looked the same. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I stood near the edge of the pool, remembering the day everything had started. Edward walked up behind me. "What are you thinking about?" I turned toward him. "This place." He looked around. "Why?" "Because this is where you changed my life." He smiled. I didn't know that at the time. Neither did I. He took my hand. John suddenly shouted from across the yard. "You two. Stop being romantic and come over here." I laughed. Edward shook his head. "He'll never change." "Good." "Why?" "Because neither will we." Edward smiled. Then he squeezed my hand. And I knew he understood exactly what I meant. That evening, as the party began to quiet down, I sat beside Edward near the pool. John had gone inside. The three of us had already laughed about the memories of the past year. But now it was quiet. Peaceful. I looked at the water. Edward looked at me. "Are you happy?" I smiled. "More than I ever expected." "Good." I turned toward him. "You?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Why?" He smiled. "Because you're here." I laughed softly. "That's all?" "That's everything." I rested my head against his shoulder. For a while neither of us spoke. The sky grew darker. The lights around the pool came on one by one. Everything felt calm. Everything felt right. I thought about the boy I had been a year earlier. The boy who believed he didn't need anyone. The boy who turned away every time someone showed interest because he was waiting for something he couldn't explain. I finally understood. I hadn't been waiting for someone who wanted me. I had been waiting for someone I wanted too. And somehow I found him in the one place I never expected. My best friend's house. At a pool party I never wanted to attend. In the person I had always told myself was completely off limits. Edward looked at me. "What are you smiling about?" I shook my head. "Nothing." "That's a lie." I laughed. "I was just thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't come that day." He smiled. "You would have stayed home." "Probably." "You would have slept all day." "Definitely." "And we would have never." He stopped. I looked at him. "Never what?" He smiled. "Never found each other." I squeezed his hand. "I think somehow we would have." He looked surprised. "How?" "Because some people are just meant to find each other." Edward smiled. "You really believe that?" "I do now." He leaned closer. "So do I." I looked toward the house. John appeared at the doorway. He looked at us. Then he smiled. "You two coming inside?" I stood. "In a minute." John nodded. I'll save you some dessert. He disappeared again. Edward stood beside me. I looked at him one last time. Then I smiled. You know something? What? That pool party was the best thing I ever almost skipped. Edward laughed. And I thought the best thing that happened that day was the food. I shook my head. Liar. He smiled. Okay. He took my hand. The best thing that happened was you came. I looked into his eyes. For a second, I thought about everything that had happened since that first afternoon. The fear. The confusion. The confession. The first kiss. The difficult conversations. The laughter. The tears. And the love. So much love. I leaned closer to him. I love you. Edward smiled. I love you too. Then he kissed me. A soft, familiar kiss. A kiss that no longer felt forbidden. A kiss that no longer carried fear. Just love. When we pulled apart, I looked at the pool one final time. The place where my old life had ended. And my new one had begun. I smiled. Because sometimes the biggest changes in our lives come disguised as ordinary moments. A phone call. A friend's invitation. A party you don't want to attend. A person you never expected to love. And sometimes, the person who changes your life is standing right in front of you, waiting for you to finally see him. I had spent years believing I was simply waiting for the right person. I was wrong. I wasn't waiting for him. He was waiting for me to be brave enough to choose him. And I did. That was all that mattered. Edward took my hand as we walked back toward the house. John was already calling us from inside. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was finally going home.